Hall County, Nebraska, October 1973. The air in the Grand Island Lions Club hall was thick with the smell of roast beef, coffee, and the first hint of frost clinging to the window panes. It was the annual harvest supper, a ritual of communal satisfaction after the last of the corn and sugar beets were in. Harold Nyberg, a retired beet farmer of 56, sat quietly, his large soil-stained hands resting on the table. Across from him, Clifford Dane, the 48-year-old agricultural lender from First Plains Bank, held court. He was a man whose confidence was as sharp as the crease in his trousers, a man who measured the world in loan-to-value ratios and square footage. The talk turned, as it always did, to winter preparations, to propane contracts and insulation. Clifford, smiling a patronizing, polished smile, reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small metal toy, a locomotive painted black. With deliberate care, he set it on the white tablecloth next to Harold's half-eaten slice of apple pie. Then he produced 3 little silver passenger cars and coupled them together behind the engine. He gave the train a gentle push. It rolled a few inches and stopped, aimed directly at Harold. "Looks like the depot's ready for winter, Harold," Clifford said, his voice just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. A few men chuckled. Walt Jensen, who'd just signed for a loan on a new split level with electric baseboard heat, laughed loudest. Everyone knew what Clifford meant. Everyone had seen Harold's home out on the edge of his old acreage. 3 surplus Navy Quonset huts, bought cheap and bolted together end to end, gleaming like a long metallic caterpillar on the flat prairie. To them, it wasn't a house. It was a temporary absurdity that had somehow become permanent. A joke about thrift that had gone on for 2 decades. It was foolish. Harold looked at the toy train. He looked at Clifford's expectant, smiling face. He simply nodded once, picked up his fork, and took another bite of pie. The mockery lasted for the span of a quiet laugh. The validation would take 6 more years of brutal Nebraska winters. What did this quiet sugar beet farmer, a man who thought in terms of soil density and root depth, understand about the physics of heat that a banker who financed entire subdivisions of modern homes had so completely and dangerously missed? Before we unpack the elegant, simple science behind Harold's strange silver home, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We explore the forgotten wisdom of those who built to survive, not just to impress. I promise by the end of this story, you will understand the profound power of thermal mass and why sometimes the most effective solutions are hidden in plain sight, disguised as foolishness. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Harold Nyberg was not a carpenter. He was not an architect or an engineer. He was a farmer, and before that, the son of a farmer who had broken the sod in Hall County with mules. He thought about the world from the ground up. He understood that the earth itself held a deep, slow patience. It held the summer's warmth long into the autumn, and the winter's chill deep into the spring. He trusted things that were heavy, dense, and slow to change. His hands knew the heft of a river stone, the dense crumb of good loam, the solid weight of a sugar beet ready for processing. His first winter as a newly married man in the old clapboard farmhouse on the property had been a lesson in desperation. That was 1946. He and his wife, Lena, had spent the season feeding the voracious coal stove, only to watch the heat flee through the thin walls and single-pane windows. They slept in coats, their breath fogging in the frigid air of the bedroom. Their first child, Carl, had a cough that lasted from November to March. The house was a sieve, leaking precious, hard-won warmth into the indifferent Nebraska wind. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem was the house. It had no memory of heat. Every morning, they had to start from zero. By 1957, with a second child, Anna, the farmhouse was failing. The foundation was crumbling and the roof leaked. Harold knew he couldn't afford to build a new house the conventional way. He had the land, but not the capital, for what the magazines and the banks were starting to push as the American dream. He didn't want another wooden box that bled BT us. He wanted a fortress of warmth. His brother Edwin was a foreman at the Great Western Sugar Refinery. During their Sunday talks, Edwin would complain about the mountains of beet-lime, a waste product from the sugar purification process. It was a dense, heavy sludge of calcium carbonate, and the plant paid to have most of it hauled away. "It's heavier than gravel, and it sets up like rock," Edwin had said one afternoon, kicking at a pile of it. "Damnedest stuff. Once it's dry, it stays whatever temperature you get it to for hours." A seed was planted in Harold's mind, a memory of heat. A few weeks later, he saw an advertisement in a farm journal. Government surplus. U.S. Navy Quonset huts, Model 20 by 56, crated and ready to ship from a depot in Iowa. They were designed for naval bases in the Pacific, built to withstand typhoons. They were simple, strong, and, most importantly, cheap. Harold drove to Iowa in his pickup, inspected the corrugated steel panels and curved ribs, and bought 3 of them for a total of $880. When the crates arrived, Lena stood with him on the plot of land he'd leveled. She looked at the stacks of curved metal sheets. "It looks like a long silver caterpillar, Harold," she said, her voice a mix of profound trust and practical concern. He just nodded. "A warm one, Lena. That's the plan." While Harold was planning his caterpillar, Clifford Dane was busy financing a different vision of the future. The 1970s saw a boom in subdivisions around Grand Island. These were the split levels and ranch houses that filled the pages of Better Homes and Gardens. They represented progress. They had attached garages, sunken living rooms, and vast picture windows facing north, offering lovely, uninsulated views of the winter winds. The failure of these homes was built directly into their design philosophy. They were products of an age of cheap, seemingly infinite energy. Their walls had minimal R11 fiberglass batt insulation, which was often poorly installed, leaving gaps for air to infiltrate. Their attics were seldom properly vented or insulated, bleeding heat straight up into the sky. They were built with lightweight materials, pine 2x4s, gypsum board, plywood sheathing. They had almost zero thermal mass. These houses were not designed to hold heat. They were designed to have heat constantly pumped into them. Their furnaces, whether propane or electric, were sized to fight a constant, losing battle against the cold. They were like trying to keep a bucket full of water that was riddled with holes. As long as the tap was on full blast, the bucket stayed full. But the moment the water pressure dropped, the failure was immediate and catastrophic. Clifford Dane saw these houses as excellent products. They were fast to build, easy to finance, and they looked impressive. They satisfied a customer's desire for modern living. He never considered the physics of their fragility. He sold the sizzle, the new appliances, the wall-to-wall carpeting, the sheer size, without a thought for the stake, which was the home's ability to provide shelter when the system supporting it inevitably failed. The older farmhouses, for all their drafty flaws, at least had some mass. Thick plaster walls, stone foundations, smaller windows. They were inefficient, but they weren't as brittle. The new houses Clifford financed were a different kind of machine, perfectly tuned for a perfect world, and utterly useless in a real one. The winter of 1979 would expose this fundamental flaw, turning dream homes into ice boxes overnight. The construction of Harold's Quonset home in the summer of 1957 was a source of local fascination and amusement. He began not with walls, but with the foundation, or rather, the floor. It was the heart of his entire concept. He dug the footings deep, well below the frost line, but the entire area within, a massive rectangle 56 feet long and 60 feet wide to accommodate the 3 huts side by side in his later plan. He excavated down 2 feet. He laid a bed of sand and gravel, and then a web of heavy-gauge rebar, tied together with the meticulous patience of a man tying fishing nets. Then came the beet-lime. For 2 weeks, his brother Edwin coordinated trucks to haul the heavy gray aggregate from the refinery. Load after load was dumped into the excavated space. Neighbors would stop their pickups on the road to watch. "That's a foundation for a grain silo, Harold, not a house," one remarked. "It needs to hold the heat," Harold replied, his standard, unadorned explanation. He didn't argue. He didn't elaborate. He just kept working, spreading the aggregate, tamping it down, preparing for the pour. The concrete pour was an all-day affair, a community event of sorts, with friends and family helping to work the screeds and floats. But this was no standard concrete mix. Harold had specified a low-water, high-aggregate formula, blending the beet-lime with Portland cement and sand. The resulting slab was 24 inches thick, a monolithic slab of manufactured stone weighing hundreds of tons. As it cured over the next month, it became the single largest, densest object for miles around that wasn't part of the earth itself. It was a battery, waiting to be charged. Next came the Quonsets. He and Edwin, with help from a few cousins, bolted the steel ribs to the concrete slab. Then, they attached the corrugated steel panels one by one, sealing the seams with tar. He chose to bolt them end to end, creating one long 168-foot structure, segmented into 3 distinct living areas. The first section was the workshop and mudroom. The middle was the kitchen and living space. The third at the far end was for bedrooms. He framed interior walls, insulated them heavily with rock wool, and paneled them with pine. But the key was that the air could circulate freely over the top of the interior rooms, under the vast, curved ceiling of the hut itself. And the floor, the massive, heat-storing floor, was continuous through all 3 sections. He installed a single, large wood-burning stove in the central living area, placing it almost directly in the middle of the massive slab. That was it. No ductwork, no secondary heaters, just one stove and a mountain of concrete. The mockery from 1957 was gentler than it became in the 70s, rooted more in confusion than condescension. "Why not just build a proper house, Harold?" people would ask. "This thing will be an oven in the summer and a freezer in the winter." He had an answer for the summer, too. He installed large, operable vents at the peak of each end cap and planted a row of fast-growing cottonwoods to the south and west. The curved roof shed the direct summer sun, and the vents created a natural convection, pulling cool air across the slab at night. For 24 winters, Harold kept a log. In an old feed ledger, he recorded the daily high and low temperatures outside, the temperature of the concrete slab in the bedroom at the far end of the house, and the amount of wood he burned. The numbers told a story of remarkable stability, even on the coldest nights. With the stove banked to embers, the temperature in the house never dropped more than a few degrees. The slab, his great stone battery, was working. The principle Harold Nyberg had harnessed was thermal mass. It's a concept as old as caves and stone castles, yet it was almost entirely forgotten in the age of cheap energy and lightweight construction. Thermal mass is an object's ability to absorb, store, and later release heat energy. The key factors are density, weight, and a property called specific heat. Think of a thin aluminum frying pan and a heavy cast iron skillet. You can heat the aluminum pan in seconds, but it also cools in seconds. The cast iron skillet takes a long time to heat up, but once it's hot, it stays hot for a long time after you take it off the flame. The cast iron skillet has high thermal mass. Harold's floor was a cast iron skillet the size of a house. Let's look at the numbers. Standard concrete has a specific heat capacity of about 0.22 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. This means it takes 0.22 BTUs of energy to raise 1 pound of concrete by 1 degree. The beet-lime aggregate his brother supplied was unusually dense. Modern analysis of similar aggregates shows they can increase the density and thermal capacity of concrete by as much as 15%. Harold's 24-inch slab, covering an area of over 1,100 square feet, weighed approximately 250 tons, or 500,000 pounds. A single degree of temperature change in that slab represented the storage or release of over 125,000 BTUs of energy. That's equivalent to the heat produced by burning 10 pounds of seasoned oak. By running his wood stove all day, Harold was slowly and steadily charging his thermal battery. The slab would absorb the heat, its temperature rising from, say, 65 degrees to 70 degrees over 12 hours. Then overnight, as the stove died down and the outside temperature plummeted, the process would reverse. The warmer slab would begin to radiate its stored heat back into the living space, a gentle, silent, and continuous process. The curved shape of the Quonset hut created a natural convection loop. The warm air rising from the floor would travel up the curved walls, cool slightly, and then sink back down in the center of the room, to be warmed by the floor again. There were no cold corners, no drafts. The entire living space, was wrapped in a blanket of radiant heat from below. He hadn't just built a floor, he had built a low-temperature radiator that also happened to be the foundation of his house. It was an incredibly elegant, self-regulating system. January 1979 arrived with a vengeance. It began with a blizzard that dropped 2 feet of snow on Hall County, followed by an Arctic air mass that sent temperatures plunging to 20 below zero, with winds that drove the chill factor to a life-threatening 50 below. The storm crippled the region. Roads were impassable. Power lines, heavy with ice, snapped in the wind. And most critically, the flow of propane to rural distributors was cut off by the storm farther up the supply line. For the residents of the new subdivisions, the crisis was immediate. Their electric baseboard heaters went dead with the power. Those with propane furnaces found their tanks running dry, with no hope of a refill. Their homes, those marvels of modern construction, began to hemorrhage heat. Within hours, the indoor temperatures matched the frigid air outside. Walt Jensen, the man who had laughed so loudly at the Lions Club supper, watched the temperature in his new split-level drop from 70 to 40 in 3 hours. By morning, it was 22 degrees inside. He and his family huddled in the living room, wrapped in every blanket they owned. They heard a sharp bang from the basement. A copper pipe, frozen solid, had burst. Clifford Dane's vision of modern living was turning into a frozen, water-damaged nightmare. The Peterson family, 2 doors down, tried to burn old furniture in their decorative fireplace, filling their house with acrid smoke, but providing little warmth. 4 miles down a wind-scoured county road, a single plume of gray smoke rose steadily from a chimney in the center of a long, silver building. Inside Harold and Lena Nyberg's Quonset home, life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. The single wood stove glowed with a well-banked fire. The air was still and quiet. A thermometer on the wall of the central living area read 64 degrees. In the bedroom at the far eastern end, 100 feet from the stove, the air temperature was 58 degrees. The concrete floor beneath the rug was passively radiating the heat it had stored the day before. Lena was baking bread. The smell filled the warm, stable air. Carl, now a grown man visiting from Omaha, was reading a book in a chair, wearing a flannel shirt, not a parka. The domestic warmth was proof of concept. One could smell the yeast, feel the even temperature, see the relaxed posture of a family utterly untroubled by the Arctic war zone outside. The house was performing exactly as its builder had intended. The vindication did not arrive with a triumphant declaration, but with a desperate knock on the door. It was Walt Jensen, his face pale and rimmed with frost. He had walked the half-mile from his stranded truck. "Harold," he said, his voice cracking, "we're freezing. My kids, we can't stay there." Harold didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't mention toy trains or harvest suppers. He just opened the door wider. "Bring them in, Walt. There's coffee on." Walt stepped inside and stopped dead. The sensation was shocking. It wasn't a blast of hot air like from a furnace. It was a deep, pervasive, absolute lack of cold. He took off his gloves. His frozen fingers began to ache as they thawed. He could feel the warmth coming up through the soles of his boots. It was the floor. The whole damn floor was warm. Within an hour, the Jensen family was settled in the middle section of the Quonset. By nightfall, 3 other families whose homes had failed had made their way to the Silver Ark on the prairie. The Petersons, the Harts, and the family of a young sheriff's deputy. They laid out sleeping bags and blankets on the floor. 14 people, including 6 children, slept soundly through the coldest night of the decade, warmed by a 250-ton concrete slab. Harold just kept the stove fed, and Lena kept the coffee pot full. On the 3rd day, a county snowplow cleared the road. Clifford Dane drove by slowly in his heated Buick. He saw the cluster of snow-covered vehicles in Harold's yard. He saw the single, efficient wisp of smoke rising into the crystalline air. He didn't stop. He couldn't. The sight was too complete a refutation of everything he sold, everything he believed in. He just drove on. The image of that functional, life-saving depot burned into his mind. That night, as the last family was preparing to return to their now thawed, damaged homes, Walt Jensen stood before Harold, his hat in his hands. He looked around at the gentle curve of the ceiling, at the simple pine walls, at the floor that had saved his family. "You know, all these years we thought you just built a strange house," Walt said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were wrong. You didn't build a house, Harold. You built a harbor." The story of Harold's Harbor became a piece of local folklore after the blizzard of '79. It was told over coffee at the co-op and in the pews after church. It was a story about resilience. But for most, the science remained a mystery. That changed when Marla Hoyer heard about it. Marla was the new county extension agent, a recent graduate from the University of Nebraska with a degree in agricultural engineering. She was sharp, curious, and believed in data. She visited Harold that spring, armed with a clipboard and a healthy dose of skepticism. Harold, in his usual quiet way, didn't try to convince her. He just showed her his feed ledgers, the 24 years of handwritten temperature data. Marla's eyes widened. It wasn't an anecdote, it was a long-term study. For the next year, she conducted a formal analysis, placing digital thermometers and thermal probes throughout the Quonset. Her official report, published by the University Extension Service, was titled, "An Analysis of a High-Mass Residential Structure Utilizing Industrial Byproduct Aggregate." It was filled with charts, graphs, and calculations of BTUs and thermal lag. It translated Harold's practical genius into the language of science. The report concluded that the structure's heating efficiency was nearly 80% higher than a conventional wood-framed house of similar size, with a thermal stability that was unprecedented in low-cost residential construction. After another brutal cold wave in 1983, Hall County officially commissioned a study based on Marla's report, looking into resilient building practices for rural housing. The idea of thermal mass, Harold's core principle, began to spread, not through the construction of more Quonsets, but through the integration of its philosophy into new designs. Thicker, insulated concrete slabs, passive solar orientation, and a general move away from the fragile, lightweight building style of the '70s. Harold Nyberg's beet-lime concrete floor, built with surplus materials and folk wisdom, was a direct forerunner of modern sustainable building science. Decades before terms like passive solar, radiant floor heating, and the circular economy became popular, Harold was living them. His design anticipated the principles of a tram wall, where a massive wall is used to store the sun's energy. His floor was a massive horizontal tram wall, charged not by the sun, but by a simple wood stove. His use of beet-lime was a perfect example of industrial symbiosis, turning one industry's waste into a high-value resource for another. He wasn't trying to be a visionary. He was just a farmer trying to keep his family warm, using the materials he knew and the land he understood. There were two competing philosophies at work on the Nebraska prairie in those years, embodied by two men. Clifford Dane's philosophy was one of consumption. It believed that progress was measured by size, newness, and complexity. It was a philosophy financed by debt and sustained by a constant, reliable input of cheap energy. His houses were designed to impress the neighbors. They were symbols of status, but their foundations were brittle, built on the assumption that the system supporting them would never fail. When the propane stopped flowing, the symbol was revealed to be a hollow, frozen shell. Harold Nyberg's philosophy was one of conservation. It believed that permanence was measured by resilience, simplicity, and efficiency. It was a philosophy financed by thrift and sustained by an elegant understanding of physics. His house was designed to hold the essential element of survival: warmth. It was a symbol of nothing but its own function. Its foundation was a 250-ton rock, a guarantee of shelter built on the assumption that other systems would, inevitably, fail. Harold and Lena lived in the Quonset until 1992, hosting winter card games for their friends, the house always a bastion of steady, silent warmth. Through the energy spikes of the 1980s, Clifford Dane's portfolio of loans on oversized, inefficient homes struggled. He saw foreclosures and bankruptcies as families couldn't afford to heat the very dream homes he had sold them. His certainty slowly eroded, replaced by a quiet, humbling obsolescence. In the winter of 1998, a snowstorm blew through Hall County. Clifford Dane, now 63 and semi-retired, was driving home when he saw a light on at the county extension office. On impulse, he pulled in. Marla Hoyer was working late. They exchanged pleasantries, and then Clifford, looking down at his hands, finally asked the question he'd been holding for nearly 20 years. "Marla," he said, "do you still have a copy of that report you did on Harold Nyberg's place? I'd like to see his notes." Marla smiled, a knowing, gentle smile. She went to a file cabinet and pulled out a thick, bound report. She handed it to him. Clifford took it, the weight of the data, the 24 years of numbers in the feed ledgers, feeling as solid and real as the foundation it described. He had spent a lifetime selling houses. Harold Nyberg had built a home. A winter house, Clifford finally understood, lasts longer when it's built to hold warmth instead of impress neighbors. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and engineering knowledge. The application of any building technique in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of quiet ingenuity valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales of forgotten wisdom. And let us know in the comments, what modern innovations do you think might prove to be as fragile as those 1970s dream homes? We look forward to reading your thoughts.